I never imagined a wedding could feel so wrong. Carmen Wells stood at the altar in a dress that probably cost more than 3 months of my rent, but her hands trembled as she held the bouquet. Not the excited trembling of a bride eager to marry, but the kind that comes from trapped nerves and no way out. The November storm had rolled in just as the ceremony began, turning the outdoor garden wedding into a frantic scramble under a massive white tent on the Ravellini estate in Long Island. Water pounded against the canvas overhead, while 200 guests shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, designer shoes sinking slightly into grass that had turned to mud. I stood with the other bridesmaids, my navy dress clinging to my skin from the humidity, watching Carmen marry a man she'd known for exactly 4 months, Alessandro Ravellini. Even his name carried weight. He stood at the altar in a black suit tailored so perfectly it might have been painted on. Dark hair swept back, his expression unreadable. At 34, he commanded the space around him without effort. People naturally leaned away, creating an invisible barrier that screamed power and danger in equal measure. His eyes were a striking shade of brown, almost amber in certain light, and they fixed on Carmen with an intensity that should have been romantic, but instead felt like assessment. I'd known Carmen since childhood, though calling us close would be generous. We'd gone to the same elementary school in Queens before her family moved to Manhattan, and mine stayed behind. We'd reconnected briefly at a charity auction last year, where I'd been working as a server between art restoration jobs. When she'd asked me to be a bridesmaid 3 months ago, I'd been surprised. We weren't exactly friends anymore. Now I understood why she'd wanted familiar faces around her. This wasn't a love match. This was a transaction. The officiant droned on about commitment and partnership, his words nearly drowned out by thunder that shook the tent poles. I tried to focus on the ceremony, on standing straight and holding my bouquet at the correct angle, but my mind kept drifting to the hospital bills waiting in my apartment. My father's oncology treatment in Ohio was bleeding me dry, and the art restoration work I could find barely covered my rent, let alone the insurance deductibles that seemed to multiply every month. That's when the crying started. A woman in the front row, elegant despite her advanced age, held a baby who had apparently decided he'd had quite sufficient of this whole affair. The wailing started soft, then escalated to full lung capacity within seconds. The kind of crying that cuts through thunder and polite conversation and every other sound in the universe. Alessandro's jaw tightened, the first crack in his composed facade. The officiant paused mid-sentence. Carmen's bouquet trembled harder. The older woman stood, bouncing the baby and whispering what I assumed were soothing Italian phrases. But the child only screamed louder. His face had gone red, tiny fists flailing in distress. He couldn't have been more than a year old, dressed in a miniature suit that would have been adorable if he weren't currently losing his mind. "Matteo, per favore," the woman pleaded softly, but Matteo was having none of it. Alessandro turned fully now, frustration evident despite his careful control. He said something quiet to the officiant, probably suggesting they continue anyway, but the man looked uncertain. You can't exactly exchange vows over an infant's meltdown. I don't know what possessed me to move. Maybe it was years of volunteering every Sunday at St. Augustine Orphanage in the Bronx, where I'd learned to soothe frightened children in a dozen languages. Maybe it was seeing the desperation in the grandmother's face. Maybe I just wanted this ceremony to end, so I could go home and stop pretending everything was normal. I handed my bouquet to the bridesmaid next to me and walked to the front row before I could talk myself out of it. The grandmother looked up in surprise as I approached. "May I?" I asked softly, holding out my arms. She hesitated only a moment before passing Matteo over, relief flooding her features. The baby was heavier than he looked, solid and warm, and he immediately grabbed a fistful of my hair while continuing to scream directly into my ear. I turned slightly away from the altar, creating a small bubble of privacy despite the 200 pairs of eyes boring into my back. Then I started humming, low and soft, the Neapolitan lullaby I'd learned from Mrs. Cardini at the orphanage. She'd sung it to every frightened child who'd come through our doors, and it had never failed to work its magic. "Dormi, dormi, oh bambin bello," I sang quietly, swaying gently. "Chiudi gli occhi, e fa la nanna." Matteo's crying stuttered, hiccuped, then stopped altogether. His grip on my hair loosened as his attention shifted entirely to my face. I kept singing, one hand supporting his back, the other gently rubbing circles between his tiny shoulder blades. His eyes, the same striking brown as Alessandro's, fixed on mine with sudden, intense focus. Then he smiled, a real, gummy baby smile that transformed his whole face. His small hand released my hair, and instead grabbed my index finger, holding tight like he'd found exactly what he'd been looking for. The tent had gone silent, except for my voice and the rain. I could feel everyone watching, but I kept my focus on Matteo, finishing the lullaby while he cooed softly and examined my finger like it was the most fascinating object in the world. When I finally looked up, Alessandro Ravellini was staring at me with an expression I couldn't decipher. Something had shifted in those amber eyes, a recognition or realization that made my skin prickle with awareness. It wasn't romantic exactly. It was more like he'd just discovered something unexpected and was recalculating every assumption he'd made. Our eyes met for 3 seconds that felt like 3 hours. Then he nodded once, a gesture of thanks or acknowledgement, and turned back to the officiant. "Please continue," he said, his voice carrying easily despite its softness. I stepped back to my place with the bridesmaids, still holding Matteo, who had apparently decided I was now his favorite person. He babbled contentedly against my shoulder, while Carmen and Alessandro exchanged vows that sounded rehearsed and empty. When they kissed, it was brief and formal, more business deal sealed than marriage celebrated. The reception was held inside the mansion, a sprawling estate that screamed old money despite the Ravellini fortune being relatively new. The decor was elegant without being gaudy, all cream and gold with fresh flowers that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. Matteo's grandmother had reclaimed him as soon as the ceremony ended, thanking me profusely in Italian, while Matteo reached back toward me and whimpered. I'd found a quiet corner near the bar, nursing a glass of champagne I couldn't really afford the calories for, when Alessandro appeared at my elbow. "Thank you," he said simply, "for helping with my son. Your son, not my nephew or my cousin's child. His son," which meant Carmen was marrying a man with a baby from a previous relationship. Another detail she'd failed to mention. "He just needed someone to sing to him," I replied, trying not to stare at how Alessandro's presence seemed to command the space around us. Up close, I could see the slight shadow of stubble along his jaw, the way his eyes tracked every movement in the room even while focused on me. Children respond well to music. You're good with him. Most people don't know that song. His gaze was assessing, curious. You speak Italian? Some. I volunteer at an orphanage that serves a lot of Italian immigrant families. You pick things up. Something flickered across his face at the mention of the orphanage, but it vanished before I could identify it. Carmen mentioned you're an art restorer. I am. I sipped my champagne, wondering where this conversation was heading. Freelance mostly. Small private collections. I have a collection that needs work. Renaissance pieces, primarily Italian. Would you be interested in consulting? The offer caught me off guard. People like Alessandro Ravellini didn't hire freelance restorers they'd just met at weddings. They went through galleries and agencies and probably required 3 references and a background check. I'd need to see the pieces first, I said carefully. Assess the damage and determine if I have the expertise. Of course. I'll have my assistant contact you. He pulled a card from his jacket pocket, heavy cream cardstock with just a phone number embossed in gold. No name, no title. Call this number Monday. We'll arrange a viewing. I took the card, our fingers brushing briefly. His hand was warm, slightly calloused, despite the obvious wealth. A man who did more than sign papers and attend meetings. Thank you for the opportunity, Mr. Ravellini. Alessandro, he corrected. Then he did the strangest thing. He looked back toward where his son was being held by the grandmother, then back at me. Thank you again. For Matteo. You gave him something he needed. Before I could respond, someone called his name from across the room, and he was gone, moving through the crowd with that same effortless authority. I stayed another hour, fulfilling my bridesmaid duties and making awkward conversation with relatives who kept asking if I was single and what I did for work. When I finally escaped into the rainy night and climbed into the hired car back to Queens, I pulled out Alessandro's card and stared at it. My studio apartment looked even smaller and shabbier when I got home, water stains on the ceiling and a radiator that clanked like it was fighting for its life. I dropped my dress on the floor, too exhausted to hang it properly, and collapsed on my bed still wearing my undergarments. My phone showed 3 missed calls from the hospital in Ohio, and 2 emails about overdue bills. I'd been avoiding them for days, hoping the art gallery would finally pay me for the last restoration job, but the check kept getting delayed. Alessandro Ravellini's card sat on my nightstand, that gold number gleaming in the streetlight filtering through my window. Working for someone like him probably meant good money, maybe even great money, the kind that could make a dent in the medical bills crushing me. But men like Alessandro didn't offer opportunities without expecting something in return. Whatever job he was offering came with strings I couldn't see yet, woven into a web I didn't understand. I should have thrown the card away. Should have stayed in my small, safe world of minor restoration jobs and weekend volunteer work. Instead, I set my alarm for Monday morning and tried to sleep, already knowing I would make that call. 2 weeks after the wedding, I'd almost convinced myself that Alessandro Ravellini's offer had been polite conversation rather than genuine opportunity. Rich men made promises they didn't intend to keep all the time, especially to people like me who existed in their peripheral vision. I'd returned to my regular schedule of restoration work that barely paid rent and weekend shifts at St. Augustine Orphanage, trying not to think about the hospital bills piling up in my apartment. Then he showed up at my studio on a Tuesday morning. No warning, no appointment. I heard the knock and opened the door, expecting my landlord demanding late rent. Instead, Alessandro stood there looking completely out of place against the peeling paint of my building's hallway. He wore a black suit, with the jacket unbuttoned, white shirt open at the collar, and sunglasses he removed as soon as I appeared. Those amber eyes swept over my paint-stained work clothes and the chaos visible behind me without judgment. "Mr. Ravellini," I managed, suddenly aware of how I must look. "I wasn't expecting you." "Alessandro," he corrected, exactly as he had at the wedding. "May I come in?" I stepped aside, watching him navigate my cramped studio with the same contained grace he'd shown at the reception. The space was maybe 400 square feet total, half of it taken up by my work area with its scarred table, scattered brushes, jars of solvents, and paintings in various states of completion. The other half held a futon that doubled as my bed, a kitchenette with a hot plate and mini fridge, and a door leading to a bathroom I shared with 2 other tenants. "This is where you work?" he asked, but it wasn't condescending. More like he was filing away information. "And live." I crossed my arms, defensive despite myself. "Not all of us can afford Long Island estates." His mouth curved slightly. Not quite a smile, but close. "No, you spend your money elsewhere. Your father's treatment in Ohio, correct?" The words hit like ice water. "How do you know about my father?" "I make it a practice to learn about people I'm considering hiring." He pulled a leather portfolio from under his arm and set it on my work table, moving aside brushes and rags without hesitation. "Joseph Mitchell, 63, stage 3 pancreatic cancer. Currently at Cleveland Clinic receiving treatment that your mother's life insurance doesn't fully cover. You send approximately $3,000 monthly to help with medical bills while living on less than $1,500 here." My hands clenched into fists. "You investigated me." I verified information. He opened the portfolio, revealing high-resolution photographs of paintings that made my breath catch despite my anger. "I don't hire strangers to work on pieces worth millions without understanding who they are." The paintings were extraordinary. Renaissance works, primarily Italian from the style and technique, each one a masterpiece that belonged in a museum rather than a private collection. I recognized the brushwork in several as belonging to minor masters of the Florentine school, possibly workshop pieces from more famous artists. The condition varied, but all showed signs of age and inadequate storage. "These are genuine," I said, unable to help myself as I leaned closer to examine the photos. "Where did you acquire them?" "Family collection. They've been in storage for years. Improperly maintained." He stood close enough that I could smell his cologne, something expensive with notes of cedar and leather. "I need them restored for display. The project would take approximately 3 months of full-time work. I'm offering $80,000. The number made my head spin. $80,000 would cover my father's treatment for 2 years, maybe more if the experimental drugs worked. It would mean not choosing between rent and hospital bills, not lying awake calculating which creditor I could put off another month. That's far above standard rates, I said carefully. Why? Because the work requires not just skill, but discretion. These pieces can't go through galleries or public restoration studios. Too many questions about provenance and ownership. His gaze held mine. You work alone. You need money desperately. And you demonstrated at my wedding that you know when to act and when to keep quiet. Those qualities are worth premium payment. There it was. The real reason. He wasn't hiring me for my restoration skills alone. He was buying my silence about whatever shady acquisition had brought Renaissance masters into the Ravellini family collection. I'd need to see the actual pieces, I said. Assess the damage in person before committing. Of course. I've had a restoration studio prepared at the estate. You can begin evaluation tomorrow if you accept. Tomorrow. Less than 24 hours to decide whether to tie myself to a man whose reputation whispered of violence and criminality, but also less than 24 hours until the hospital's next bill would arrive. Another reminder of how badly my father needed help I couldn't afford to provide. I accept, I heard myself say. But I have conditions. The work stays professional. I evaluate the pieces, provide honest assessment of what can be restored, and complete the job to my standards, not yours. If something is beyond my expertise, I refer you to someone more qualified. Agreed. He extended his hand. My driver will collect you at 9 tomorrow morning. We shook, his grip firm and warm, and I had the unsettling sensation that I'd just made a deal whose full terms I didn't understand. The next morning, a black car appeared outside my building at exactly 9. The driver was a large man with a broken nose and the kind of stillness that suggested military or security background. He said nothing during the hour drive to Long Island, but I felt his eyes checking the rearview mirror regularly, assessing threats I couldn't see. The Ravellini estate looked different in daylight. Still impressive, but less intimidating without the storm and wedding chaos. The mansion sprawled across manicured grounds, all creamstone and elegant windows, speaking of wealth that wanted to appear old even if it wasn't. Alessandro met me at the door personally, now dressed in dark slacks and a charcoal sweater that made his eyes look almost gold. Welcome, the studio is ready. He led me through hallways decorated with art that would make collectors weep, past rooms where staff members moved quietly, their eyes sliding away from me in that particular way that suggested they'd been told not to acknowledge guests. We climbed to the second floor, walked down a corridor lined with family portraits, and stopped at double doors Alessandro unlocked with a key from his pocket. The studio beyond was perfect. North-facing windows flooded the space with clear light. Temperature controls hummed almost inaudibly, and work tables held equipment I'd only dreamed of owning. Ultraviolet lamps for examining paint layers, infrared imaging equipment for seeing beneath the surface, microscopes for detailed analysis, and every solvent, varnish, and pigment I could need arranged in careful order. This is incredible, I breathed, moving to examine the setup. This equipment alone must have cost $50,000. 62, he corrected. But necessary for the work. The paintings are in the climate-controlled cabinet. I opened the specified cabinet and found myself face-to-face with 7 Renaissance works that were even more stunning in person than in photographs. My fingers itched to begin examination immediately, to lose myself in the technical challenges each piece presented. I'll need time, I said. Full assessment could take a week before I can provide accurate restoration timelines. You have complete access. The studio is yours during business hours. Alessandro moved to the door, then paused. One more thing. My son Matteo occasionally wanders this floor. His nursery is down the hall. If he disturbs your work, inform the staff and they'll keep him contained. He's not a disturbance, I said, remembering the baby's grip on my finger at the wedding. Children respond well to quiet spaces. If he wants to visit, he's welcome. Something shifted in Alessandro's expression, too quick to identify. As you wish. He left me alone with the paintings and questions I couldn't quite voice. Why was I really here? What did Alessandro Ravellini actually want from me beyond restored artwork? And why did the way he'd looked at me when I mentioned Matteo make my skin prickle with awareness that had nothing to do with fear? I pushed the questions aside and got to work. The paintings needed me, and for now that would have to be reason sufficient. The The first week passed in intense focus. I documented each piece with photographs and notes, used UV light to examine previous restoration attempts, and employed infrared imaging to map the paint layers beneath the visible surface. The work revealed fascinating details, workshop techniques and pigment choices that spoke to the painting's origins. But I couldn't entirely ignore the household drama unfolding around my quiet studio. Carmen appeared occasionally, always dressed impeccably, always maintaining perfect distance. She never asked about my work, never stayed long, and her eyes held the kind of resigned unhappiness that comes from accepting an unpleasant fate. "How are you settling in?" she asked one afternoon, her voice polite but empty. "The studio is wonderful. Alessandro has been very accommodating." Her laugh was bitter. "Alessandro is always accommodating when he wants something. Just remember that everything here comes with expectations attached." She left before I could ask what she meant. Matteo became my regular visitor. The baby would appear in the doorway held by his grandmother, those amber eyes so like his father's scanning the room until they found me. Then he'd make happy sounds and reach out, clearly requesting transfer. The grandmother, whose name I learned was Sophia, would smile and hand him over. "He remembers you from the wedding. You made quite an impression." I'd hold Matteo while working, the baby content to sit on my lap and watch me examine paintings with tools he found endlessly fascinating. He'd babble commentary in what sounded like Italian mixed with baby nonsense. His small hands occasionally reaching to touch brushes I kept carefully out of reach. Alessandro found us like that one afternoon, me seated at the work table with Matteo on my lap, both of us examining a particularly intricate section of gilding under magnification. "He's disrupting your work," Alessandro said from the doorway, but his voice lacked conviction. "He's company. I don't mind." I glanced up, surprised by the expression on Alessandro's face, something vulnerable and raw that vanished the moment he noticed me watching. "Does he stay here at the estate full-time?" "Yes. His mother isn't involved." The words were clipped, discouraging further questions, but I caught the implication. Matteo's mother, whoever she'd been, was gone from his life entirely, which made Carmen a stepmother to a 10-month-old, whose existence she clearly resented. That night, after returning to my studio apartment, I researched the Ravellini family more thoroughly. The results were exactly what I'd expected and feared. Alessandro Ravellini, 34, head of what multiple sources delicately termed an import-export business with rumored organized crime connections. His first wife had died in childbirth 3 years ago, and Carmen Wells had married into the family just weeks before. I was working for the Mafia, restoring probably stolen art for a man who might have blood on his hands. The sensible thing would be to quit immediately, take whatever partial payment Alessandro offered, and return to my safe, struggling existence. Instead, I returned to the estate the next morning, because my father needed treatment, and I needed money more than I needed clean conscience. And because Alessandro Ravellini watched me work with intensity that suggested I wasn't just there to restore paintings, though what else he wanted remained frustratingly unclear. 6 weeks had passed since I'd accepted Alessandro's offer, and the rhythm of working at the Ravellini estate had become routine. The early morning drive from Queens to Long Island, the security gate that always opened precisely as the car approached, Sophia's quiet greeting in the foyer, and the climb to my restoration studio on the 2nd floor. The work itself consumed me completely, hours disappearing as I examined paint layers under magnification, tested cleaning solutions on microscopic sections of canvas, and slowly revealed colors that had been hidden under centuries of grime and oxidized varnish. The paintings were extraordinary, each one requiring different approaches and techniques. I documented every step meticulously, photographing before and after each treatment, keeping detailed notes about pigment composition and structural issues. It was the kind of work I'd dreamed about in graduate school. The projects I'd hoped to tackle at major museums before my father's diagnosis had derailed those plans. Alessandro visited the studio occasionally, always with that same controlled intensity, watching me work with an attention that felt like weight against my shoulders. He'd ask technical questions sometimes, about the painting's origins or my restoration methods, but more often he'd inquire about my time at St. Augustine Orphanage. The questions seemed casual, but they always circled back to the same themes. The children's backgrounds, how long they typically stayed, what happened to those who were never claimed by family. I'd answered honestly at first, then with growing unease as the pattern became clear. He was searching for something specific, though I couldn't determine what. Matteo remained my faithful companion during work hours. The baby would appear most afternoons, carried by Sofia or sometimes Alessandro himself, and would immediately reach for me with happy sounds. I'd grown genuinely attached to him, this serious 10-month-old with his father's amber eyes and a temperament that shifted from cranky to content the moment someone sang to him in Italian. Carmen never came to collect him, never even asked about him when I encountered her in the hallways. The distance between stepmother and stepson was obvious and sad. On a Friday afternoon in late October, Alessandro found me in the studio examining a particularly challenging piece under UV light. He carried Matteo on his hip, the baby drowsily fighting sleep. "I need you to assess some additional pieces," he said without preamble. "They're stored in the attic. Sofia will show you the way." I nodded, setting aside my tools. "When would you like me to look at them?" "Now, if you're available. The sooner I have your evaluation, the better." 20 minutes later, Sofia led me through parts of the mansion I'd never seen before. We climbed a narrow staircase at the far end of the second-floor corridor, the walls closing in as we ascended into older sections of the house. The air grew mustier, the lighting dimmer, and I found myself stepping carefully on floorboards that creaked under my weight. "Mr. Ravellini doesn't come up here often," Sofia said as she unlocked a heavy wooden door at the top of the stairs. "These pieces belong to his first wife's family. They've been in storage since she passed." The attic was exactly what I'd expected from a Long Island estate. All exposed beams and dusty corners, boxes stacked haphazardly between forgotten furniture. But against the far wall, carefully covered with protective cloth, stood several large paintings. "Take your time," Sofia said. "I'll be downstairs if you need anything." The door closed behind her with a solid thunk that echoed in the enclosed space. I approached the covered paintings, pulling back the first cloth carefully. Beneath were 3 canvases in varying states of preservation. Nothing remarkable about any of them. I documented them quickly with my phone camera, making mental notes about the restoration work required. The second stack was more interesting, including what appeared to be an early Renaissance Madonna that would require extensive cleaning. I was crouched beside it, examining the frame, when I noticed one more painting leaning against the wall behind the others. Partially hidden, I pulled it forward into better light and felt my breath catch. It was a portrait of a boy, maybe 6 years old, painted in oils with remarkable skill. The child sat formally, hands folded in his lap, wearing clothing that suggested the portrait was recent rather than antique. But it was his face that stopped my heart. Those large, solemn brown eyes that seemed to track me as I stared, the serious expression that belonged on someone much older, the way dark hair fell across his forehead. I knew this face. I'd seen it dozens of times, drawn in crayon and pencil by uncertain hands, recreated obsessively in sketch after sketch at St. Augustine Orphanage. This was Luca, who'd arrived at the orphanage 2 years ago with no memory of his life before being found in Grand Central Station. Luca, who spoke fragments of Italian and refused to talk about his past. Luca, who drew the same man's face over and over, always getting the eyes right. Those distinctive amber-brown eyes that were currently burning into me from the doorway. "I asked you to evaluate the paintings, not remove them from storage." Alessandro's voice was quiet, controlled, but underneath ran a current of something dangerous. He stood in the attic entrance, perfectly still, except for the tension visible in his shoulders. My hands shook as I carefully set the portrait down. I was just examining them all. This one was hidden behind the others. He crossed the space in 4 long strides and picked up the portrait himself, holding it like something fragile and precious. His face had gone completely blank, that careful mask he wore during business dealings, but his knuckles were white against the frame's edge. "This room is off limits from now on," he said, his voice devoid of inflection. "You'll work only on the pieces already in your studio. Is that understood?" "Alessandro, who is this child?" The question hung in the dusty air between us. He looked at me for a long moment, and I watched something crack in his expression before he forced it back under control. "My son, Luca. He was taken 3 years ago during a home invasion that killed his mother. The police presumed him dead after a year of searching. Each word came out measured, deliberate, like he was reading from a script he'd memorized. This portrait was commissioned 6 months before he disappeared. My mind raced through possibilities and implications. Alessandro, there's a boy at St. Augustine Orphanage. I know. The words cut through the air like a blade. I've known since the second week you worked here. Why do you think I hired you? Why I asked so many questions about the children there? The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. My hiring hadn't been about my restoration skills at all, or not primarily. I was Alessandro Ravellini's unwitting connection to a child he believed might be his son. Does he know? I managed to ask. Have you confirmed it's actually him? I needed someone he trusts first. Someone who could make the introduction without causing panic, or alerting whoever kept him hidden all this time. Alessandro's jaw worked. You were that person from the moment you calmed Matteo at my wedding. You demonstrated exactly what I needed. Someone with access to St. Augustine. Someone Luca might respond to. Someone desperate enough for money that you wouldn't ask too many questions too quickly. The manipulation should have angered me. But all I felt was a strange sort of resignation. Of course, Alessandro Ravellini didn't do anything without layers of purpose. Of course, my hiring had been strategic rather than coincidental. What do you want me to do? I asked quietly. He set the portrait down with infinite care, running one finger along the frame's edge. Nothing yet. I have investigators running DNA comparisons, confirming identities. If it's truly Luca, if he's really been 5 miles away this entire time. His voice cracked slightly before he controlled it. Then we'll proceed carefully. Very carefully. Whoever took him, whoever kept him hidden, they can't know we've made the connection. Not until I understand who and why. He draws you, I said softly. Luca. He draws the same face constantly. Never quite getting it right, but always trying. I think he remembers more than he admits. Alessandro's eyes closed briefly. When they opened, they held a raw vulnerability I'd never seen before. Show me. Next time you volunteer, photograph his drawings. I need to see them. I nodded, understanding that I'd just crossed some invisible line into Alessandro Ravellini's inner circle, into secrets that could get me killed if the wrong people discovered I knew them. The portrait stays here, he said, moving toward the door. You saw paintings that need standard restoration. Nothing unusual. Nothing memorable. Can you do that? Yes. He paused at the threshold, looking back at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Thank you, Gabriella, for being exactly who I needed you to be. Even before either of us knew it. Then he was gone, leaving me alone in the dusty attic with covered paintings and the weight of knowledge I'd never wanted. I looked once more at the portrait of the solemn child with his father's eyes, then carefully covered it again and descended the stairs. That night, back in my queen's apartment, I couldn't sleep. I kept seeing Luca's face in the portrait, kept thinking about the quiet boy at St. Augustine, who drew obsessively and flinched at sudden movements. Keep thinking about Alessandro Ravellini carrying his baby son while searching desperately for his lost one. I'd come to this job for money to save my father. Instead, I'd stumbled into a tragedy that was still unfolding, and I had no idea how to navigate the dangerous waters I'd just entered. All I knew was that walking away now was impossible. Not just because of the money, but because Luca deserved to know his father was alive and searching, and Alessandro deserved to know his son had survived. Whatever came next, I was committed. For better or worse, I'd become part of the Ravellini family's story, and there was no going back. 3 days after finding the portrait, I couldn't eat, couldn't focus on restoration work, couldn't stop thinking about the boy with Alessandro's eyes sitting in an orphanage 5 miles from where his father lived. The weight of the secret pressed against my chest like a physical thing, making every breath feel deliberate and difficult. I needed a plan. Something that wouldn't alert whoever had taken Luca in the first place, wouldn't put the boy in danger, but would give Alessandro what he desperately needed, confirmation and a path forward. On Sunday morning, I drove my beat-up Honda to St. Augustine Orphanage in the Bronx for my regular volunteer shift. The building looked exactly as it always did. Red brick weathered by decades of city grime. Chain-link fence surrounding a small playground where kids shouted and played despite the November chill. But everything felt different now. charged with purpose and danger I'd never noticed before. Luca was in the art room, as he usually was on Sundays, hunched over a sketch pad with the intense focus he brought to everything. I watched him for a moment before approaching, noting the way his dark hair fell across his forehead, the serious set of his mouth, the careful precision of his pencil strokes. "What are you working on?" I asked, settling into the chair beside him. He glanced up, and something in his expression relaxed. "Buildings. I like drawing buildings." I looked at the sketch, my heart clenching. It was the Ravellini estate, unmistakably, though drawn from a child's fragmented memory. The arched windows, the stone facade, even the garden fountain were all there, rendered in surprising detail for a 7-year-old. "That's beautiful work," I said carefully. "Have you seen this building somewhere?" Luca shrugged. That evasive gesture I'd learned meant he was uncomfortable. "Maybe. I dream about it sometimes." "And a man with eyes like mine." My throat tightened. "Tell me about the man." "He's tall. He sounds like the priests who speak Italian at Mass. In my dreams, he holds my hand, and we walk through gardens." Luca's pencil moved across the paper, sketching quick lines. "But it's just dreams, made-up things." I watched him draw for a few more minutes, then made my decision. "Luca, would you like to meet someone who might be able to help the orphanage? A man who wants to donate money for art supplies and maybe a field trip?" His eyes widened slightly. "Who?" "A businessman. He's Italian, like you. He has a baby son who might visit too." Luca considered this with the gravity only children who've learned not to trust easily can manage. "Okay. When?" "Soon. Let me arrange it." I left the orphanage an hour later with photos of Luca's drawings on my phone and a plan forming in my mind. Back in my apartment, I called Alessandro's number, the one he'd given me for emergencies. He answered on the first ring. "Gabriella, I need to talk to you. Not at the estate. Somewhere private. Give me an address." We met at a small cafe in Queens, far from both the Ravellini estate and St. Augustine. Alessandro arrived alone. No security detail visible, though I suspected they were nearby. He wore jeans and a dark jacket, looking almost normal except for the tension radiating from him. "Show me," he said without preamble as soon as he sat down. I pulled out my phone and showed him the drawings. Alessandro's hands shook as he zoomed in on each image, his face going pale when he saw the sketch of the estate. "He remembers," Alessandro whispered. "After all this time, he still remembers. Not consciously. He thinks they're dreams, but yes, he remembers." I leaned forward. "I have an idea, but it's going to require your cooperation and patience." Alessandro looked up, those amber eyes burning with intensity. "Whatever it takes. The orphanage needs funding. They're always desperate for donations. I'm going to tell the director that I know someone interested in supporting their art program, maybe sponsoring a field trip to a museum. You'll visit as a potential donor, meet the kids, see Luca in his environment without forcing direct contact. And then, we see how he reacts to you. If there's recognition, if he feels safe. Meanwhile, you need to get DNA confirmation without him knowing. Can you do that?" Alessandro nodded slowly. "I have contacts. Former FBI, now private security. He can pose as a volunteer, collect a sample discreetly. Hair or saliva would work. But Alessandro, you can't push this. If whoever took him is watching, if they realize we've made the connection, they won't." His voice was steel. "I've been hunting for him for 3 years. I know how to be careful." We spent the next hour planning every detail. The donation would be substantial, but not so large it drew unusual attention. Alessandro would visit with Matteo and Sofia, presenting himself as a widowed father who wanted to give back to the community that had helped him after loss. The ex-FBI investigator would volunteer the following week, running a health screening program that would give him access to collect samples. "One more thing," I said as we prepared to leave. "You need to understand that even if the DNA confirms what we both already know, Luca might not be ready to accept you immediately. He's been through trauma. He's built walls. This could take time." "I've waited 3 years," Alessandro said quietly. "I can wait as long as he needs. I just need to know he's safe, and that I can be part of his life again." 2 days later, I approached the director of St. Augustine, a tired woman named Margaret, who'd been running the facility for 15 years on charity and hope. I have a potential donor, I told her. Alessandro Ravellini. He's a businessman with personal reasons for wanting to support orphanages. He's willing to fund a substantial art program and possibly cover costs for educational field trips. Margaret's eyes lit up. How substantial? I'm not certain, but he mentioned figures in the tens of thousands. When can he visit? We arranged the meeting for the following Friday. Alessandro arrived at exactly 2 p.m, carrying Matteo on his hip, with Sofia walking beside him. He looked the perfect picture of a devoted father and concerned philanthropist, nothing in his demeanor suggesting the violent man Carmen had married, or the mob boss I knew he was. The children gathered in the common room, some shy, others bold, all curious about the visitors. Luca hung back near the wall, watching with those careful eyes. Alessandro gave a brief speech, speaking in accented English about loss and community, and the importance of supporting children who'd experienced trauma. His gaze kept drifting to Luca, but he was subtle, never staring long enough to make it obvious. Then Matteo started fussing, reaching out toward the other children. Alessandro shifted him, and in that movement, Luca stepped forward slightly, his expression changing. Recognition, maybe. Or just the pull of a memory he couldn't quite place. "You can touch him," Alessandro said gently, noticing Luca's attention. "He likes other children." Luca approached slowly, reaching out to let Matteo grab his finger. The baby laughed, and Luca's face transformed with a smile so genuine it hurt to see. "He likes you," Alessandro said, his voice carefully neutral despite the emotion I could see in his eyes. "What's your name?" "Luca. That's a good Italian name." "Do you speak Italian, Luca?" "A little. I forget most of it." They stood there for a long moment. Father and son, separated by years, and trauma and secrets neither could voice. Then Matteo grabbed Luca's whole hand, and Alessandro smiled. "He doesn't usually take to strangers so quickly," Alessandro said. "You must be special." Luca shrugged, but I saw the way he looked at Alessandro. Really looked, as if trying to solve a puzzle only he could see. The visit lasted an hour. Alessandro toured the facility, wrote a check that made Margaret gasp, and promised to return with specific plans for the art program. Through it all, he was professional, warm, appropriate. No one watching would have guessed they were seeing a father who'd just been reunited with his lost child. As Alessandro prepared to leave, Luca approached him one more time. "Will you come back?" the boy asked quietly. "Yes," Alessandro promised. "Very soon." After they left, I helped clean up the common room. Luca found me putting away chairs. "He seemed familiar," Luca said, "like someone from before I came here." My hands stilled. "Maybe he reminds you of someone you knew." "Maybe." Luca looked at his drawings scattered across the art table. "Or maybe I'm remembering wrong. The doctor says my memories from before aren't reliable. Memories can be tricky," I agreed carefully. "But feelings are usually true." "Did you feel safe with him?" Luca considered this with that heartbreaking seriousness. "Yes, I felt safe." The following week, Alessandro's investigator arrived. He was a compact man in his 50s who introduced himself as Frank, former FBI turned private security consultant. He ran health screenings, checking vision and basic vitals, chatting easily with the children while collecting information. When Luca sat for his screening, Frank managed to collect a hair sample that fell during the examination, pocketing it with practiced subtlety. The whole interaction took less than 10 minutes. The sample went to a private lab that specialized in paternity testing. Alessandro paid extra for expedited processing and complete confidentiality. 5 days later, Alessandro called me at midnight. I answered groggily, heart hammering. "The results came back," he said, his voice thick with emotion. 99.9% match. "He's mine, Gabriella. Luca is my son." I sat up in bed, fully awake now. "What happens next?" "You keep doing exactly what you're doing. Be his constant, his safe person. I'll continue visiting the orphanage as a donor, building trust slowly. And I'm going to start investigating who took him and why, because someone inside my own organization had to have facilitated this. Someone who knew our security, our patterns, our vulnerabilities. That's dangerous, Alessandro. Everything about this is dangerous. His voice hardened. But Luca is alive, and I'm getting him back. No matter what it costs. After we hung up, I sat in the darkness of my apartment, thinking about the boy who drew buildings from memory and the father who'd never stopped searching, thinking about the danger we were all in now that we knew the truth. I'd come to New York to be an artist. I'd taken Alessandro's job to save my father. And somehow, I'd ended up at the center of a story about loss and hope and the lengths people will go to protect the ones they love. Outside my window, the city hummed with its usual chaos. Inside my chest, my heart beat with the knowledge that everything was about to change, and there was no going back to the simple life I'd once known. The DNA confirmation changed everything and nothing at once. Alessandro had proof his son was alive, but Luca remained in the orphanage, vulnerable and unaware. For 6 weeks after receiving those results, Alessandro became a ghost, haunting 2 worlds simultaneously. He appeared at St. Augustine every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon, always with Sofia and Matteo, always bringing donations or organizing activities. To the orphanage staff, he was the generous benefactor establishing an educational foundation. To Luca, he was becoming something else entirely, someone familiar and safe. I watched their relationship develop with my heart in my throat. Alessandro never rushed, never pushed. He'd sit on the floor during art time, Matteo crawling between his legs, and help Luca with his drawings. He'd speak Italian occasionally, casual phrases that made Luca's eyes light with recognition, before confusion clouded his face again. "Why do I understand you?" Luca asked one afternoon, setting down his pencil. "The sisters say I spoke Italian when I arrived, but I don't remember learning it." Alessandro's hand stilled on the paper he'd been sketching. "Sometimes we know things deeper than memory. Language lives in a different part of us." Luca considered this seriously. "Like how I know buildings I've never seen?" "Exactly like that." I stood in the doorway watching them, father and son circling recognition neither could name, and wondered how much longer we could maintain this careful fiction before something broke. Back at the estate, the atmosphere grew increasingly tense. Matteo had become my shadow during work hours, refusing to let Sofia take him unless I was occupied with restoration work that required both hands. Carmen noticed, of course. She'd appear in doorways watching me hold her stepson, her expression unreadable. "You're good with him," she said one evening, startling me as I rocked Matteo to sleep in the studio. "Better than I ever was." "You're his stepmother," I replied carefully. "He needs you. He needs someone who actually wants him." Carmen moved closer, her heels clicking on the hardwood. "Alessandro married me for political alliance, not love. Matteo is a constant reminder of what I can never be, the mother of his real children, the woman he actually chose." The bitterness in her voice was so raw it hurt to hear. "Carmen, don't." She held up a hand. "I'm not looking for comfort. I'm warning you. You're getting involved in something complicated and dangerous. My family has expectations. Alessandro has obligations. Whatever you think is happening between you 3, remember that nothing in this world comes without cost." She left before I could respond, and Matteo stirred against my shoulder, making soft sounds in his sleep. That night, Alessandro asked me to meet him in his office after the household had settled. I found him surrounded by documents, exhaustion evident in the set of his shoulders. "My consigliere Roberto finished his investigation," he said without preamble. "The kidnapping 3 years ago wasn't random. It was orchestrated by someone inside my organization who sold information about our security protocols and Luca's schedule to the Moretti family." My stomach dropped. The Morettis? Carmen's family? Her uncle, specifically. Russo Moretti, an underboss. Alessandro's voice was cold, controlled fury barely contained. "They took my son, killed my wife, and then years later forced me into marriage with Carmen to cement their control. They've been using family alliance to infiltrate my operations. Does Carmen know? That's what I need to determine." He looked up at me, amber eyes haunted. "Roberto found documents in her personal safe, communications with her uncle that referenced St. Augustine. She either knows Luca is alive and has been lying to me for months, or her family has been using her as an unwitting pawn. The weight of that knowledge pressed against my chest. What are you going to do? Confront her, but carefully. If she's complicit, she's dangerous. If she's innocent but compromised, warning her could get Luca killed. He stood, moving to the window. I need more time to understand how deep this goes before I can bring Luca home safely. Over the following weeks, I became Alessandro's eyes and ears in ways I'd never anticipated. At the estate, I watched Carmen's movements, noting when she made phone calls, tracking visitors who arrived when Alessandro was away. At St. Augustine, I documented everyone who showed unusual interest in Luca, photographing faces and license plates. The orphanage itself remained my refuge and my greatest source of anxiety. Luca was blossoming under Alessandro's attention, his drawings becoming brighter, his nightmares less frequent according to the night staff. But I also noticed things that set my nerves on edge. A man in a dark car parked across the street 3 afternoons running. A new volunteer who asked too many questions about which children were adoptable. Small things that might mean nothing, or might mean everything. I reported each one to Alessandro, who assigned additional security to watch the orphanage from a distance. His men were invisible to me, but knowing they were there helped me sleep at night. Then Carmen made her move. I was working late at the estate one Friday evening, absorbed in restoring a particularly delicate section of gilding, when Carmen entered the studio. She looked different, disheveled in a way I'd never seen, her perfect makeup smudged, her hands shaking. "I need to tell you something," she said, closing the door behind her. "Something Alessandro doesn't know yet." I set down my tools, pulse accelerating. "What is it?" "My uncle, Russo. He's been pressuring me for information about Alessandro's business dealings. I thought it was just normal family politics, the usual inter-family intelligence gathering. But last week, he asked specifically about St. Augustine." Her voice cracked. "He wanted to know if Alessandro had shown unusual interest in any of the children there." The blood drained from my face. "What did you tell him?" "Nothing. I said I didn't know anything about Alessandro's charitable work." She wrapped her arms around herself. "But Gabriella, my uncle doesn't ask idle questions. If he's focused on St. Augustine, it means he knows something, or suspects something." "Why are you telling me this?" Carmen's eyes met mine, and I saw genuine fear there. "Because I just found out why Alessandro really married me." Roberto left documents on Alessandro's desk, investigation reports about my uncle's involvement in Adriana's murder and the kidnapping of Alessandro's first son. Tears spilled down her cheeks. "My family used me. They forced this marriage knowing what they'd done, using me as a tool to keep control over Alessandro." She sank into a chair, shoulders shaking. "I didn't know. I swear I didn't know they'd killed his wife and taken his child. They told me it was a business arrangement, that Alessandro needed our family's political support. I thought I was helping broker peace between the families. I didn't know whether to believe her, but the devastation in her voice sounded genuine. "Does your uncle know you've discovered this?" "No. I've been pretending nothing has changed." "But Gabriella, if he's asking about St. Augustine, if he's figured out that boy might be Luca," she looked up at me desperately. "You need to warn Alessandro. Protect that child. Whatever my family is planning, it's happening soon." I found Alessandro in his office minutes later, relaying everything Carmen had said. His face went completely blank. That dangerous stillness that meant he was calculating moves in a chess game I couldn't see. "Roberto," he said into his phone. "Full lockdown on St. Augustine. Nobody enters that building without my explicit approval. And bring Carmen to my office. Now." The confrontation happened an hour later. Carmen sat across from Alessandro's desk while Roberto stood by the door, his expression neutral but alert. I remained as well, at Alessandro's request, a witness to whatever came next. "Your uncle knows about Luca," Alessandro said without preamble. "How long have you known he was alive?" Carmen's hands twisted in her lap. "I only found out tonight, reading the investigation reports Roberto left. Before that, I knew nothing about the kidnapping beyond what the news reported. Everyone believed Luca was dead, but you knew your family was involved in Adriana's death." "No!" The word burst from her. I knew my uncle had conflicts with you, that there'd been violence between the families, but they told me Adriana's death was an accident, collateral damage in a territorial dispute. They never said it was targeted, that they'd taken your son. Alessandro studied her for a long moment. I want to believe you, Carmen, but your family has given me no reason to trust any of you. Then don't trust me based on my family, she said, voice steady despite the tears. Trust me based on my actions. I'm telling you what my uncle asked, warning you that he's closing in on St. Augustine. If I were working with him, I would never reveal that. The logic was sound, but Alessandro's expression remained closed. Or you're delivering a message your uncle wants me to receive, creating panic that makes me act rashly. Alessandro, please. Carmen leaned forward. I know I've been a terrible wife. Cold, distant, resentful of a marriage I never wanted. But I'm not a monster. If that boy is your son, if he's been alive all this time, he deserves to be home with his father. Let me help you protect him. The room fell silent, except for the ticking of the antique clock on Alessandro's desk. Finally, he nodded. Roberto will monitor all your communications. You'll have security detail everywhere you go. One wrong move, one hint that you've betrayed this confidence, and you'll face consequences I promise you won't survive. Understood? Understood, Carmen whispered. Then help me. Tell your uncle nothing has changed. Continue your normal routine. And if he asks about St. Augustine again, you know nothing. Alessandro's voice was steel. In the meantime, we prepare to move Luca somewhere safer. If the Morettis are circling, we're running out of time. After Carmen left, Alessandro turned to me, exhaustion and determination warring in his expression. It's time. We can't wait any longer. Luca needs to come home, even if it means war with the Moretti family. I nodded, understanding that the careful patience we'd maintained for weeks was about to shatter into action. Whatever came next would change all our lives irrevocably. The storm we'd been trying to avoid was finally here. Alessandro's plan to recover Luca quietly disintegrated on a rainy November afternoon at St. Augustine. The lawyers were still finalizing custody paperwork. Roberto was coordinating logistics for transitioning Luca to the estate, and I'd spent the morning preparing Luca emotionally for the possibility of living with Mr. Ravellini on a trial basis. Everything was proceeding with careful precision, until it wasn't. I arrived at the orphanage just after lunch, shaking rain from my jacket as I signed in at the front desk. The familiar sounds of children echoing through hallways, Margaret's voice drifting from her office, the smell of institutional food mixed with cleaning supplies. Normal, safe. Everything I'd come to expect from Tuesday afternoons spent volunteering. Luca was in the art room working on a drawing of the Ravellini estate gardens. His memory of those grounds was getting sharper, more detailed with each of Alessandro's visits. I settled beside him, admiring the careful way he'd rendered the fountain. That's beautiful work. You have a real gift for remembering spaces. He glanced up, offering a small smile. Mr. Ravellini says I can visit anytime I want. He says I might live there someday if I like it. My chest tightened with affection and fear in equal measure. Would you like that? I think so. He makes me feel safe. Like I knew him before, even though I don't remember. Before I could respond, glass shattered somewhere on the first floor. The sound was sharp, wrong, followed immediately by shouting in Italian that made my blood freeze. Not staff, not parents, something else entirely. Luca's pencil clattered to the table, his face draining of color. Around us, 6 other children looked up with wide, frightened eyes. Everybody up, I said, forcing calm into my voice. Art supply closet right now. Quickly and quietly. The children moved, thank God, responding to the authority in my tone, even though they didn't understand what was happening. I herded them toward the large storage closet at the back of the room, counting heads as they filed inside. 7 kids total, including Luca. Gunfire erupted downstairs. Sharp cracks followed by screams. Inside, all the way to the back, I ordered, shoving aside bins of paint and stacks of paper to make room. Sit down. Stay quiet. Don't make a sound no matter what you hear. Luca grabbed my hand, terror stark on his face. What's happening? I don't know, but we're going to be safe in here. I pulled him into the closet with the others and locked the door from the inside, my hands shaking so badly I could barely turn the mechanism. Everyone sit down. Cover your ears if you need to. Stay absolutely silent. I positioned myself between the children and the door, heart hammering against my ribs. Through the thin gap at the bottom of the door, I could see shadows moving in the art room. Heavy footsteps. More voices in Italian, harsh and commanding. Someone tried the closet door. The handle rattled violently. I clamped my hand over my mouth to keep from crying out. Behind me, one of the younger children whimpered. Luca pressed himself against my side, trembling. The person on the other side cursed in Italian and kicked the door twice before moving away. I heard more gunfire, closer now, and running footsteps that sounded like multiple people converging on our floor. Then Alessandro's voice cut through the chaos, sharp with command. Secure the stairwell. Nobody leaves this building until I say. Relief flooded through me so intensely I felt lightheaded. He'd come. Of course he'd come. His security team must have been watching the orphanage as planned. The sounds of fighting continued for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. More shouting, a final burst of gunfire, then an eerie silence broken only by distant sirens. "Gabriella!" Alessandro's voice, rough with panic. "Gabriella, where are you?" "Here," I called back, my voice cracking. "Art room closet. We're locked in." The door rattled as he tried it from outside. "Open it. It's safe now." My hands shook so badly I could barely work the lock. When the door finally opened, Alessandro stood there looking half wild, gun still in his hand. A streak of blood across his jacket that I desperately hoped wasn't his. His eyes found me first, then dropped to the children huddled behind me. When he saw Luca, something in his face cracked open. "You're hurt," he said, and I realized dimly that he was looking at my left arm where warm wetness soaked through my sleeve. I glanced down, surprised to see blood. I didn't even feel it. Alessandro holstered his weapon and reached for me, but I shook my head. "The children first. Get them out of here." Roberto appeared in the doorway with 2 other security men I recognized from the estate. "Building is secure. 2 shooters down, 1 in custody. Police are 2 minutes out. Get these kids to the gymnasium where staff can account for them," Alessandro ordered. "Gabriella and Luca come with me. Now. We can't just leave. The police will have questions we can't answer, and every second we stay puts Luca at greater risk." Alessandro's voice was steel. "Roberto, handle the authorities. Tell them I was here as a donor and helped secure the children, nothing more." Roberto nodded once and began ushering the other children out. I stood on shaking legs, Luca's hand locked in mine. Alessandro moved to us, cupping my face with one hand, while the other supported my bleeding arm. "Can you walk?" "Yes." "Then we go. Out the back entrance before the police arrive." The next 10 minutes passed in a blur of motion and adrenaline. Alessandro guided us through service corridors I didn't know existed, down a back staircase, and out a delivery entrance where a black SUV waited with engine running. Sophia sat in the back seat with Matteo, her face pale but composed. Alessandro lifted me into the vehicle, then Luca, before climbing in himself. The driver pulled away as the first police cars screamed up to the front entrance. "Where are we going?" I managed to ask. "Safe house in New Jersey. Medical team is already there." Alessandro kept pressure on my arm, his other hand reaching for Luca, who sat frozen between us. "You're both safe now. I promise." Luca looked between Alessandro and me, confusion and fear warring on his young face. Who were those men? Why did they want to hurt us? Alessandro's jaw tightened. "Bad people who made a terrible mistake. They won't get another chance." The safe house was a nondescript 2-story home in a quiet suburban neighborhood, the kind of place that would never draw attention. Inside, it was furnished comfortably but simply, clearly maintained for exactly this type of emergency. A doctor was waiting, a middle-aged woman with gentle hands who examined my arm and determined the bullet had only grazed me. She cleaned and bandaged the wound, while Alessandro hovered, his control finally starting to fracture around the edges. "It's not serious," the doctor assured him. "She'll be sore for a few days, but there's no permanent damage." After she left, Alessandro pulled me into his arms with a desperation that made my throat tight. "When I heard the shots, when I couldn't find you immediately, I'm okay. We're okay." He pulled back enough to look at me. and I saw everything he'd been holding back. Fear, fury, relief, and something deeper that made my heart stutter. "You saved them," he said quietly. "7 children who could have died if you hadn't acted so quickly. Including my son. Anyone would have—" "No," he cut me off. "Not anyone. You risk your life to protect children who aren't even yours. You've been doing it since the moment you met Matteo at my wedding, since every Sunday at St. Augustine. You're remarkable, Gabriella, and I'm done pretending you're just my art restorer or Luca's friend." Before I could respond, Matteo toddled over, reaching up with both arms. Alessandro lifted him, and the baby immediately reached for Luca, who stood nearby, looking lost. "Brother," Matteo said clearly, patting Luca's head. Luca's eyes filled with tears. "I don't understand what's happening." Alessandro knelt, bringing himself to Luca's eye level while still holding Matteo. "I know everything is confusing right now, but you're safe here with people who care about you very much. Can you trust that for now?" Luca looked at me, and I nodded encouragingly. "Mr. Ravellini keeps his promises. If he says you're safe, you're safe." "Okay," Luca whispered. That night, after both boys were asleep in rooms Sophia had prepared, Alessandro found me standing at the window watching streetlights flicker on in the gathering dusk. My arm throbbed despite the painkillers, but physical discomfort paled next to the emotional whiplash of the day. Roberto confirmed it was Russo Moretti's men. Alessandro said quietly. They were going to take Luca and use him as leverage against me. Carmen's warning saved his life. What happens now? Now I petition for emergency custody based on the DNA evidence in today's attack. The courts will move quickly given the circumstances. He moved closer, not quite touching me, but near enough that I could feel his warmth, and I'm going to eliminate the threat permanently. Russo made his move. Now I make mine. Alessandro, I know what you're going to say, that violence isn't the answer, that there are legal channels. But Gabriella, these people killed Luca's mother. They've tried twice to take my son. Legal channels won't stop them from trying again. I turned to face him, exhausted and aching. I'm not naive enough to think your world works by normal rules. I just don't want you to become the kind of monster Luca should fear. Something softened in his expression. He reached up, cupping my face gently. You see the best in everyone, even me. It's one of the things I love about you. The words hung between us, weighted with meaning neither of us had dared voice until now. You love me, I repeated softly, from the moment you sang to my son at that wedding. Maybe even before, when I first saw you delivering food and talking about art with such passion. His thumb brushed my cheekbone. I've been falling since then, trying to convince myself this was just convenient, just practical. But watching you protect those children today, seeing you hold Luca like he's yours, I can't pretend anymore. I closed the distance between us, kissing him with everything I'd been holding back. Fear and relief, affection and desire, the acknowledgement that somewhere along this impossible journey we'd become something real. When we finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Alessandro rested his forehead against mine. Stay with us, he said. Not as an employee, not as a convenience. Stay because this is where you belong. I thought about my tiny Queens apartment, my struggling art restoration business, my father in Ohio whose medical bills were finally under control thanks to Alessandro's generous payment. Thought about the life I'd planned versus the one unfolding around me. Then I thought about Matteo's laugh, Luca's tentative trust, and the man whose arms currently held me like I was precious beyond measure. Yes, I whispered. I'll stay. We stayed at the safe house in New Jersey for 3 days before Alessandro made his move. Those days existed in a strange, suspended state, where normal routines continued despite nothing being normal at all. Sophia cooked meals. Matteo played with his toys. Luca slowly began to relax. And I pretended my arm didn't throb every time I moved wrong. But underneath the domestic facade, Alessandro was planning war. On the 4th morning, he found me in the kitchen nursing coffee while watching both boys eat cereal at the table. I'm calling a sit-down with the 5 families, he said quietly. Tonight. Roberto has secured a neutral location. My stomach dropped. What are you going to do? End this, permanently. His voice was cold, devoid of the warmth he showed the boys. Russo Moretti orchestrated my wife's murder, took my son, then infiltrated my family through Carmen. The council needs to hear the evidence and pass judgment. And if they don't rule in your favor? Alessandro's expression went dark. Then I handle it myself and deal with the consequences. The meeting was set for 7 that evening at a restaurant in Brooklyn that had been in the same family for generations, neutral territory where disputes had been settled for decades. Alessandro left at 6 with Roberto and 4 security men, dressed in a black suit that made him look every inch the dangerous man he was. Before walking out the door, he pulled me aside. If I don't come back, don't say that. If I don't come back, he continued firmly, Roberto has instructions. You and the boys will be protected. There's money in accounts only you can access. Legal documents giving you guardianship of both Luca and Matteo. My throat closed. Alessandro. He cupped my face in both hands and kissed me hard. I love you. Remember that. Whatever happens tonight. Then he was gone, and I was left alone with Sophia and 2 children who had no idea their father might not survive the evening. I tried to maintain normalcy, reading bedtime stories to both boys, but my mind kept drifting to that restaurant in Brooklyn. What was happening? Was Alessandro safe? Had Russo brought his own men? Would this end in bloodshed? By 9, both boys were finally asleep. Sophia and I sat in the living room, neither of us speaking, both watching our phones. At 9:45, mine buzzed with a text from Alessandro. It's done. Coming home. Relief flooded through me so intensely I started shaking. Sophia squeezed my hand, tears in her own eyes. Alessandro walked through the door at 11, looking exhausted but unharmed. I flew into his arms, checking him for injuries, needing physical proof he was really here. What happened? He sank onto the couch, pulling me down beside him. I presented evidence to the council. Financial records showing Russo paid for the hit on Adriana. Testimony from one of his men who participated in Luca's kidnapping. DNA proof that Luca is my son and has been alive this entire time, hidden deliberately by the Moretti family. And Russo was given a chance to defend himself. He didn't deny any of it. Alessandro's jaw tightened. He claimed it was justified, that my first wife's family had insulted the Morettis and needed to be taught a lesson. That taking Luca was leverage to control me. What did the council decide? Unanimous vote for execution. Russo Moretti was found guilty of violating the most sacred code, killing an innocent woman and harming a child. He was dealt with immediately. The clinical way he said it sent chills down my spine. He's dead. Yes. I should have felt something, horror maybe, or moral outrage. Instead, I just felt tired. What about Carmen? The council ruled she was an unwitting pawn. Her uncle used her to gain access to my organization without her knowledge of his original crimes. Alessandro ran a hand through his hair. She's being granted annulment of our marriage and permission to relocate to Europe with financial support. In exchange, she's sworn never to return to New York or have contact with any member of the Moretti family. That's generous. She saved Luca's life with her warning. I owe her that much. He pulled me closer. The marriage is over, Gabriella. Within a month, I'll be legally free. The implication hung in the air between us. Free to marry again if he chose. Free to build a real family with someone he actually loved. What happens now? I asked quietly. Now I petition the courts for custody of Luca using the DNA evidence and Carmen's testimony about the kidnapping. Given what happened at St. Augustine, and with Russo dead, there's no one left to contest it. He took my hand. I'm bringing my son home. Both my sons, officially. 2 days later, Carmen came to the safe house. She looked smaller somehow, fragile in a way I'd never seen at the estate. Her eyes were red from crying, her designer clothes replaced with simple jeans and a sweater. Alessandro met her in the study while I waited in the hallway with the boys. Through the door, I could hear their voices, too low to make out words, but the tone was civil at least. After 20 minutes, Carmen emerged. She saw me holding Matteo, Luca standing close beside me, and something cracked in her expression. I'm sorry, she said, her voice breaking. For everything. I didn't know what my family had done. If I had, I never would have agreed to marry Alessandro. I never would have let them use me like that. I believe you, I said, and meant it. She approached Matteo, who turned his face away from her. Carmen's composure shattered completely. I was a terrible mother to you. I know that. You deserved better. She touched his hair gently. Gabriella will take good care of you. She already loves you more than I ever could. Before I could respond, she turned and left, Sophia escorting her to a waiting car that would take her to the airport. Alessandro found me still standing in the hallway, both boys now clinging to me. She's gone? Luca asked quietly. Yes, she's moving far away. Good, Luca said with a child's blunt honesty. She was always sad here. Maybe she'll be happier somewhere else. That night, Alessandro sat both boys down for a conversation I'd been dreading. Luca was old enough to understand, at least partially, and he deserved truth. Luca, do you remember anything from before you came to St. Augustine? Alessandro asked gently. Luca frowned, concentrating. Sometimes. I remember a pretty lady with dark hair who sang to me, and gardens, and feeling safe. That lady was your mother. Her name was Adriana, and she loved you very much. Alessandro's voice was steady despite the pain evident in his eyes. 3 years ago, bad men hurt her and took you away from me. You were lost for a long time, but now I've found you again. Luca looked at him with those serious amber eyes. You're my father? My real father? Yes, but I thought you were just the nice man who brought presents to the orphanage. I was looking for you, Alessandro said, hoping you were my son. And when I found out for sure, I promised myself I would never lose you again. Luca processed this, his young mind working through implications. So Matteo is really my brother? Yes, and if you want to, you can come live with us. With me, Matteo, Sophia, and Gabriella. Will Gabriella stay? Luca asked, turning to me. You won't leave? I'm not going anywhere, I promised. Luca looked between Alessandro and me, then at Matteo, who was playing with blocks obliviously. Finally, he nodded. Okay, I'll stay. The legal process moved faster than expected, helped by Alessandro's money and connections. Within 2 weeks, he had temporary custody of Luca, with full adoption proceedings underway. We moved from the safe house back to the Long Island estate, which felt both familiar and completely different with Carmen gone. My father called the day we moved back, his voice stronger than it had been in months. The experimental treatment was working. The doctor's optimistic about his prognosis. I told him about Alessandro, about the boys, about the strange new life I'd stumbled into. You sound happy, he said. Really happy. I am. Then that's all that matters, sweetheart. Life takes us strange places sometimes. What matters is who we choose to be when we get there. 3 weeks after the council meeting, Alessandro woke me before dawn. Come with me. I want to show you something. We drove to the estate's boathouse, where a small sailboat waited. Alessandro helped me aboard, and we sailed out onto the calm morning water as the sun rose over Long Island Sound. When we were far from shore, he cut the engine and turned to me. When Adriana died, I thought I'd never feel whole again, that the best parts of me died with her. He took both my hands. Then you walked into my life, calming my son at my wedding, and everything changed. Alessandro, let me finish. He smiled. You restored more than paintings in my home. You restored hope. You gave me back my son. You showed Matteo what real love looks like. And you made me believe I could be more than the violence my world demands. He pulled a small box from his pocket and opened it, revealing a ring that caught the early morning light. Marry me, Gabriella. Not because it's convenient or political. Marry me because I love you. Because you're already the mother my sons need. Because I want to spend every day for the rest of my life being worthy of you. I couldn't speak past the emotion choking me. Instead, I nodded, tears streaming down my face. Alessandro slipped the ring on my finger and pulled me into a kiss that tasted like salt air and new beginnings. When we returned to the estate hours later, both boys were waiting on the front steps with Sophia. Luca spotted the ring immediately. Does this mean Gabriella is staying forever now? He asked. Forever, Alessandro confirmed. Matteo clapped his hands, shouting something that might have been Mama, and Luca allowed himself a rare full smile. Standing there in the morning light with Alessandro's arm around me and both boys running forward to hug us, I thought about the journey that had brought us here. From that stormy wedding where I'd soothed a crying baby, through art restoration and orphanage visits, through violence and fear, and finally to love. It wasn't the life I'd planned, but looking at my new family, I wouldn't change a single moment. 8 months passed like pages turning in a book I'd written without knowing the ending. Winter melted into spring. Then summer arrived with its heavy heat and long evenings that stretched golden across the estate's gardens. In that time, our fractured family slowly knit itself into something whole. Luca's therapy sessions continued weekly, helping him process memories that surfaced in fragments. He'd remember pieces of his early childhood, his mother's voice singing Italian lullabies, the gardens he'd drawn obsessively at St. Augustine. The therapist said his mind was protecting him, revealing only what he could handle processing. Alessandro attended every session when his schedule allowed, learning how to support a traumatized child who was slowly remembering the father he'd lost. One evening in late spring, we were having dinner together, all 4 of us at the kitchen table instead of the formal dining room. Matteo was making a mess with his pasta. Luca was telling Alessandro about a book he'd been reading, and I was refilling water glasses when it happened. Luca paused mid-sentence, fork suspended above his plate, his eyes distant. "Papa," he said quietly, testing the word. Then louder, with certainty. "Papa." Alessandro froze, his own fork clattering to the plate. "What did you say?" "Papa." Luca looked at him with those serious amber eyes. "That's what I called you before. I remember now. You taught me to say it in Italian when I was little." Alessandro's composure shattered. He pushed back from the table and crossed to Luca, pulling him into an embrace so tight I worried he might hurt the boy. But Luca wrapped his arms around his father's neck and held on just as fiercely. "I remember you," Luca whispered. "Not everything, but pieces. You used to carry me through the gardens and tell me stories about your grandmother in Italy. You taught me to swim in the pool. You were always there. I never stopped looking for you," Alessandro said, voice breaking. "Not for a single day." Matteo, sensing the emotion without understanding it, climbed down from his chair and wrapped his arms around both of them. I stood watching my family hold each other, tears streaming down my face. That night marked a turning point. Luca began calling Alessandro Papa regularly, the Italian endearment coming more naturally than the English dad. His nightmares decreased, his smiles came more easily, and the serious, guarded expression he'd worn like armor at St. Augustine gradually softened into something more age-appropriate. My father's health continued improving, the experimental treatment working better than anyone had dared hope. In June, he was declared in remission and flew to New York to meet Alessandro and the boys properly. I'd been nervous about the meeting, but my father and Alessandro found common ground discussing art, history, and the challenges of raising children in difficult circumstances. "You make her happy," my father told Alessandro while we were cleaning up after dinner. "I can see it in her eyes. She's found where she belongs." "She saved my family," Alessandro replied. "I intend to spend the rest of my life being worthy of that gift." By July, the legal proceedings were finalized. Luca's adoption was approved, making him officially Luca Ravellini again. The judge who signed the papers commented that she'd never seen such overwhelming evidence of a child belonging with his family. "Take care of each other," she said when we left the courthouse. "You've earned this happiness." That night, Alessandro found me in the studio I'd finally finished restoring. The last painting from his family collection gleamed under careful lighting, its colors vibrant after months of patient work. "It's beautiful," he said, studying the Renaissance masterpiece. "You brought it back to life. It was always beautiful. I just helped people see it again." He turned to me, taking both my hands. "Marry me this month. I don't want to wait anymore." We'd been engaged since that morning on the sailboat, but neither of us had pushed for immediate wedding plans. There'd been too much chaos, too many legal proceedings, too much healing that needed to happen first. But now, with Luca settled and happy, with Matteo calling me Mama, without hesitation, with our family finally whole, there was no reason to delay. "Yes," I said simply. "Let's get married." The wedding took place on a Saturday evening in late July, in the same garden where I'd first calmed Matteo at Alessandro's wedding to Carmen. But this ceremony bore no resemblance to that tense, rain-soaked affair. The sky was clear, the air warm, and fewer than 30 people filled the chairs arranged in front of a simple arbor woven with flowers. My father walked me down the aisle, his hand steady on my arm despite the cane he still carried. Luca stood beside Alessandro as ring-bearer, wearing a miniature version of his father's suit and taking his responsibilities with adorable seriousness. Matteo sat with Sofia in the front row, occasionally calling out "Mama" and waving enthusiastically. The officiant was the same one who'd married Alessandro and Carmen, but he seemed genuinely happy this time as he asked us to state our vows. Alessandro went first, his voice steady, despite the emotion clear in his eyes. "When you walked into my life, I was a man haunted by loss, convinced the best parts of me had died with Adriana. You proved me wrong in every possible way. You gave me back my son. You loved Matteo when no one else could. You restored not just paintings, but hope, family, and my faith that good things could still exist in my dark world. I promise to protect you, cherish you, and spend every day being the man you believe I can be. Ti amo con tutto il cuore." I hadn't prepared formal vows, but standing there looking at the man who'd become everything I hadn't known I needed, the words came easily. I came to New York to restore art and save my father. Instead, I found a family I didn't know I was missing. You and these boys have given my life purpose and meaning beyond anything I could have imagined. You're not perfect, Alessandro. Your world is dangerous and complicated and sometimes terrifying. But you're also the best father I've ever seen. A man who would move heaven and earth to protect the people he loves. I promise to stand beside you through whatever comes, to love your sons as my own, and to never stop believing in the good man beneath the dangerous reputation. I love you completely." The officiant smiled. "By the power vested in me by the state of New York, I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss your bride." Alessandro pulled me into a kiss that was both tender and possessive, claiming me in front of everyone who mattered as definitively his. When we broke apart, Matteo was cheering, Luca was grinning, and my father was wiping away tears. The reception was simple and joyful. Dinner served on the terrace as the sun set over Long Island Sound. Luca gave a short speech about being happy to have a mother again, delivered with such earnest sincerity that half the guests cried. Matteo insisted on cutting the cake himself, and ended up covered in frosting. My father danced with me to a song my mother had loved, whispering that she would have adored seeing me this happy. As the evening wound down and guests began departing, I found myself standing at the garden's edge with Alessandro, watching Luca and Matteo chase fireflies across the lawn with Sofia supervising nearby. "Do you ever regret it?" Alessandro asked quietly. "Giving up your quiet life for all of this chaos?" I leaned into him, breathing in the scent of his cologne and the night-blooming jasmine growing nearby. Not for a single second. Even knowing who I am, what I do, you're Luca and Matteo's father, my husband, a man who protects his family fiercely and loves with everything he has. I turned to face him. The rest is just context. He kissed me again, softer this time. "Thank you for seeing me. The real me, not just what everyone expects. Thank you for letting me." The years that followed brought the normal chaos of raising two boys. Luca's memories continued returning in pieces, enough that he felt connected to his past, but not so much that it overwhelmed him. He excelled in school, particularly in art and languages, showing his mother's creativity and his father's intelligence. Matteo grew into an energetic, affectionate child who brought constant laughter into our home. I converted the restoration studio into my permanent workshop, taking on select clients and occasionally consulting for museums. My father visited regularly, his health stable, delighted by his grandsons, even if they weren't technically his by blood. Alessandro's world remained dangerous, but he kept that violence carefully separated from our home life. He was Alessandro Ravellini, the businessman, when he walked through our door, leaving the mob boss at the gate. The boys knew their father was powerful and respected, but they also knew him as the man who taught them to sail, helped with homework, and read bedtime stories in Italian. 5 years after our wedding, I found Alessandro in his office late one night, reviewing business documents. I set down the cup of coffee I'd brought him and settled into his lap. The boys are asleep. Both of them begged for one more story. But I held firm. He smiled, wrapping his arms around me. You're a better disciplinarian than I am. I can never say no when they ask for another chapter. That's because you're a complete pushover when it comes to them. Guilty. He kissed my temple. But they're good boys. Luca especially. He's grown into such a thoughtful young man. He looks like you. Acts like you too when he's not drawing. He has his mother's artistic talent, and your kindness. Alessandro pulled me closer. I never thought I'd have this again. A family. A home. Someone who loves me, despite knowing all my darkness. Your darkness is part of you. I love all of it, even the parts that scare me sometimes. We sat together in comfortable silence, the kind that comes from years of knowing each other completely. Outside the window, the estate garden stretched into darkness. But inside our home, everything was warm and safe, and exactly as it should be. The portrait of young Luca that I'd found in the attic hung now in Alessandro's office, a reminder of what we'd almost lost and what we'd fought to reclaim. Next to it was our wedding photo, and beside that, a recent picture of all four of us on the sailboat, windblown and laughing, a family rebuilt from fragments of loss and trauma and unexpected love. Not perfect, but ours. And that was more than sufficient. The end.